back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going all the way back to October 2005 and taking a look at what I like to refer to as Dark Hole Reaper format. Dark Hole Reaper format is one of my favorite formats of all time, and it is an incredibly underappreciated format. The Dark Hole Reaper format needs to be put into full context. Obviously, this is a history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Channel, which means we get not only into strategies and deck profiles, but as much history and context as possible as well. This format took place immediately after GOAT Control, and to me resolved a lot of the issues that even modern-day players complain about when they go back and play GOAT Control. You hear modern-day players talk about GOAT Control and some of the things they don't like. They'll very quickly cite Trinity, Pot of Greed, Delinquent Duo, Graceful Charity, Sinister Serpent. Well, all those are banned. They also often complain about one of the most common criticisms I hear about GOAT format is that some of the games devolve into a waiting game in terms of who can assemble Ring of Destruction, Black Luster Soldier, and Heavy Storm first, because those three cards are really difficult to interact with in combination with one another, and often are enough to tilt the game in your favor, if not outright win. Well, Ring of Destruction and Black Luster Soldier are also banned in this format, not only to mention other cards that were banned on this particular ban list, like Tribe Infecting Virus and Mirror Force. As a result of all that, we have a format where you play a lot of the same cards, right? There's one Magician of Faith, Koichi's playable, Chaos Sorcerer is quite playable, Cyber Dragon was released at the end of GOAT format. There's a huge component of the format. Cards like Zaborg are becoming popular. So you play a lot of one-for-one trades. You play a lot of nickel and diming. Without the existence of Mirror Force, you can attack a little bit more freely. And as a result, cards like Sakuratsu Armor and even Widespread Ruin became incredibly popular. And then the whole name of the format, Dark Hole Reaper format, to tell you a lot. Dark Hole is at 1. You have to worry about it. It is one of the cards that can tilt the game in your favor by generating a +1. But the fact that Spirit Reaper, a card that was at 3, is incorporated in the name tells you a ton. This format, because every +1 really mattered, a card like Spirit Reaper was perfect, because if you dealt damage with Spirit Reaper and discarded a card out of your opponent's hand, they still need to deal with that Spirit Reaper. Whether that's by utilizing another Sakuratsu Armor or Widespread Ruin, whether that's using their own Dark Hole, whether that's a Chaos Sorcerer effect, Zaborg effect, they need to interact with it in some way, shape, or form, and usually that also generated a +1 for you. And as a result, one single Spirit Reaper successfully attacking directly often generated a +1, and maybe even sometimes even snowballed if your opponent didn't have an out to it. You know, cards like Scapegoat are only at 1 in this format. As a result, Spirit Reaper became a huge integral part of this format. And to me, any format that really tries to nickel and dime back and forth is a format that I really, really enjoy. And this format actually resolves a lot of the issues that people complain about with GOAT format. So to me, it's a format that a lot of people should go back and try, because I think it encapsulates that old school Yu-Gi-Oh! From almost 20 years ago, really close to 20 years ago, but also gets rid of some of the cards that people often complain about. Today, we're going to profile what I think is a quintessential Dark Hole Reaper deck. It is specifically a deck that's going to use all 3 copies of Spirit Reaper really to emphasize that. Not that that was especially staple per se, but it was very common to see it. All right, we'll start the deck profile off with 2 copies of Mobius the Frost Monarch. So this format was predicated on one-for-one interactions. The one-for-one interactions out of the trap lineup that people basically played across the board was Sakuratsu Armor, often full playsets, and then even Widespread Ruin was seen, and I'll show you that when I get to this deck's trap lineup. As a result, Mobius pretty reliably hit usually just 1, right, because Heavy Storm is legal in the format, also Mobius was popular, 1 trap card that otherwise would have one-for-one traded with a monster. So by having Mobius in your deck, obviously you contribute, hit the Sakuratsu, hit the Widespread Ruin, and attack. You had to worry about Torrential Tribute. That was the most common chainable card. Technically Book of Moon too, but that's not that big of a deal. It's, you know, you could then set your own Sakuratsu Armor and protect your Mobius. You also had to worry about Return from the Different Dimension in this format, so being able to preemptively hit Return from the Different Dimension is actually a pretty good trade-off. It wasn't inconceivable that you'd play against burn decks here or there too, so having cards like Mobius in your main deck, plus Breaker, plus Dust Tornado, plus Heavy Storm, MST, it gave you some pretty good resiliency against trap-based decks like that. Not overwhelmingly popular, but it's definitely there. So Mobius just slotted really well into what this format was all about, which is advantageous card exchanges, trying to get as many +1s as possible, grind your opponent out through that. Plus the 2400 attack threshold is no joke. There are plenty of outs to it, all things considered, but your opponent does need one, right? 1000 defense being relatively low is actually pretty good, because if you have this and another monster, Smashing Ground often can't kill this. A lot of people actually had Tsukiyomi either in their side deck or main deck just to counteract the Monarchs that were popular in the format, right? 1000 defense is lower than Tsukiyomi's attack. But we have 2 copies of Mobius. I think it's a really good encapsulation of what this format was about, main decking cards like Mobius. One thing I'm going to point out, because I don't know if I'd otherwise point this out, Zaborg was legal, Zaborg obviously being the first Monarch. Zaborg tends to be more popular in formats where the flip effects are incredible. Magician of Faith, although legal, Trinity was entirely banned, other than maybe Confiscation, and even that wasn't overwhelmingly popular. as good of a card as Magician of Fate is, it's not as backbreaking as it was during GOAT format. There's no Graceful Charity, no Delinquent Duo, no Pot of Greed. So having a card like Mobius is a good representation of what this format was about, because you're trying to hit back rows and then attack over monsters, not summons a Borg and preemptively hit a flip effect. We have 2 copies of Cyber Dragon. You can play 3 copies of Cyber Dragon. Some players elected to do so. I think 2 is a pretty nice number looking back at some old decks. I think it's representative of what you would typically see, so I've elected to go with 2. Maybe we'd play 3 if we actually went back and replayed this format, but 2 Cyber Dragons. You know, this is relatively soon after Cyber Dragon was released, right? It was released at the very, very end of GOAT format in CRV. This is the format right after that. So we're looking at the first couple months of this card's existence. Players are still feeling out what Cyber Dragon really does to the game, allowing you to attack over or attack into a DD Assailant, DD Warrior Lady, and then set a monster main phase 2, maybe a DD Survivor, DD Warrior Lady yourself. Maybe try and reestablish board presence, bait out Sakuratsu armors, right? People are really starting to learn how good Cyber Dragon is. So maybe 2, eventually 3 becoming more popular when we get to some of the later formats. Then we have 3 copies of Spirit Reaper. So I couldn't call this Reaper Dark Hole format without finding a deck list that had 3 copies of Spirit Reaper. Honestly, if you go back and look at the format, I think 2 was more common, but there were plenty of players that had success with the full 3. The fact that this card was popular in either 2 or 3, in addition to looking at Mobius, I think really puts into context the type of format we're looking at. You know, the idea with Reaper is anytime you can get attack in, hit a card out of their hand, and I'll force them to have to exchange a Smashing Ground or a Battle Trap like Sakuratsu Armor, you've just shown one card getting that easy +1, and in a format where +1s are so difficult to come by, now that Pot of Greed is banned, Mirror Force is banned, you really want to be able to get those interactions, and Spirit Reaper is just one of those cards where if you warp your deck to support Spirit Reaper, and then even a card like Don Zalug, you'll be able to get those +1s by hitting cards out of your opponent's hand and then forcing your opponent to react. I actually think Reaper is better than Don Zalug, even though it obviously has lower attack and it's not a warrior. Just because, you know, with Don Zalug, even if you get a card out of your opponent's hand, if they attack over it, it kind of offsets that advantage. Reaper's totally different. You can get a card out of your opponent's hand and then just shift it to defense and sit there until your opponent has to do something to get rid of it, usually having to spend a card in doing so, particularly in this format with the type of cards that were popular. Cards like Chaos Sorcerer, which started to counteract Spirit Reaper, were played, but we're not yet a Chaos Return format where I think people realized that just jamming 2 or 3 Chaos Sorcerers was probably the right thing to do. This was the format prior to that where people were starting to explore, I'll take a Sorcerer now that Blackluster Soldier's banned, before realizing that maybe Chaos Sorcerer is the best card in the format monster-wise, and maybe we should play multiple copies. So Reaper pretty reliably hit a card out of your opponent's hand when you're able to get it through, and then could just sit there shifting to defense when they started to build up their board afterwards. But we have 3 copies of Reaper, and then as I just mentioned, 2 copies of Don Zalug. To go with the Warrior package, which was really popular this format, we also have 2 copies of DD Assailant. So if I go back and think about this format, the cards that stand out the most to me are Spirit Reaper, obviously Reaper Dark Hole format. Dark Hole, even though it's at 1, was obviously in your mind. Any format where +1s are so hard to come by, you're really reluctant to put that second monster on the field if it's going to be game breaking. And the same has been true with formats with Heavy Storm, of which there's tons of retro formats where Heavy Storm is legal and people kind of know what it feels like to get Heavy Storm for more than 1. Dark Hole is going to have a similar effect in a format that's so slow, where one single Dark Hole can really be game breaking, you know, let alone your opponent Dark Hole into 2 monsters and then summoning Reaper or Dawn. DD Assailant, though, is another card that really comes to mind. A lot of people played 2 or 3 copies of DD Assailant. It's just one of those monsters that you don't mind getting hit by a Sakuratsu armor or Widespread Ruin, but if it just sits there on the field, their opponent does have to deal with it, whether it's use a Smashing Ground and you're totally fine with that 1-for-1 trade, your opponent having to attack over it with a Monarch, 1-for-1 trade, attack with Cyber Dragon, 1-for-1 trade. It's just one of those cards that almost always 1-for-1s by having a reasonable attack as well. Right? You do still need to win the game. Card advantage, although is incredibly important, isn't the sole determiner of winning. Having a monster with a reasonable attack strength that just can sit there in 1-for-1 eventually is really important. In addition to that, we also have 1 copy of Mystic Swords in level 2. You know, although flip effects, as I mentioned with Mobius versus Zaborg, isn't the most important and most worrisome thing, having a single copy because you're playing double reinforcements of the army is useful. We also have 1 copy of DD Warrior Lady. If we're going to play Assailant, we're going to play Warrior Lady. This card is usually considered better, even though it has lower attack strength, just because it's a little bit more versatile with the option. One interesting choice that wasn't 100% included in Wario Toolbox decks, but I think it's a really interesting inclusion, and it's the first time I've been able to profile this as a tech card, is a copy of DD Survivor. So if your opponent is playing multiple assailants and warrior lady, which at the point of the format that I'm profiling was actually pretty common to see at least 3 copies of these, if not having the full playset of DD assailants, being able to reinforce into the army for DD Survivor and just attack one of these, get it off the field, and then have this revive itself during the end phase can be pretty valuable. Cards like Bottomless weren't overwhelmingly popular, but you technically get to play around Bottomless too. It's a pretty cool card in that sense, where you can counteract the popularity of the DD cards by having a DD Survivor in your deck of all things. Then to round out the monster lineup, we have a small Mystic Tomato package, 2 tomatoes, and obviously a copy of Sangan. Besides the Sangan, you can get all 5 of these, so that is our, relatively small Mystic Tomato package. We're not coupling it with Creature Swap. It's just there as another monster that can kind of sit there, be defensive. Your opponent, it's one of those cards that guarantees a 1-for-1 trade-off for the most part, because the Borg's not overwhelmingly popular and people aren't necessarily onto Chaos Sorcery yet, where eventually your opponent needs to use a DD Warrior Lady, eventually they need to use Smash and Ground, Dark Hole, eventually you can attack and your opponent has to use a 1-for-1 trap card or some type of interaction that's just an easy 1-for-1, right? As long as your cards can minimum 1-for-1, you're in good shape, and then eventually you can set up a situation where maybe you have a big attack strength monster and you can crash, get out a hand card, Reaper or Donzalug, attack over their monster with, let's say, Mobius or Cyber Dragon, DD Assailant, and then attack directly with the guy you got off Tomato, and all of a sudden you can rip a card out of your hand, and you're generating card advantage. Oh, and there's obviously a copy of Breaker, any format where there's going to be a ton of trap cards, Sakuratsu Armors, Widespread Ruins, even Dust Tornadoes. Format of 1-for-1's obviously going to play Breaker. Breaker is an unbelievable card in the context of what this format was all about. So as I was saying with the monster lineup, I tried to find a deck that I think represented the format really well, and even though we call it Dark Hole Reaper format, maybe we should call it Smash and Ground Reaper format, because a lot of players like to play multiple copies of Smash and Ground. I decided just to find the most cliche version of this deck and just play 3 straight up Smash and Grounds to couple with the 3 copies of Reaper. You can kind of see where this format is going, where in the back of everyone's mind is Dark Hole, so you don't necessarily want to put too many cards on the field, but at the same time, you don't want your opponent just to go summon Reaper, activate Smash and Ground, that plays around Torrential, and you not have a battle trap to counteract that. So triple copies of Smash and Ground. Then we have 2 copies of Reinforcements of the Army. As I mentioned, we have a Warrior toolbox that was pretty evident with the monsters. We have MST and Heavy Storm. We want to get through our Reaper shots. We want to get through our Donzalug. We have the all-important single copy of Dark Hole. Oftentimes it's more important to play around, not more important, but probably correct statistically to consider Smash and Ground more than Dark Hole. But again, we have 4, I'm going to call it 1-for-1 or potentially 1-for-1 plus spell cards for removal to get through our Reaper and Donzalug. Then we have Premature Burial. It's kind of another one of those cards you can bring back Donzalug. It is one of the advantages of Dawn over Reaper, where you can bring back Donzalug with maybe another monster, DD Assailant, DD Warrior Lady, and then get through a Donzalug attack. A single copy of Book of Moon. This wasn't overwhelmingly popular, but it is good against Monarchs, which can sometimes be a problem if you don't have a Smash and Ground and your opponent's unwilling to attack you, right? If your opponent's going to sit there with a Mobius or as a Borg, even if that card's not overwhelmingly popular, or Thestalos in the actual Monarch deck, you do want ways to kind of proactively deal with it. You don't want to sit there and say, okay, are you eventually going to attack? You don't necessarily want to be stuck with just reactive counters. We have a copy of Nobleman of Crossout. That's at 1. There's still cards that we set. This deck doesn't have a ton of them, but you do still see cards that are set. Spy, for example, is pretty good against this deck in general, so Spy was pretty popular. People did still play Magician of Faith. And then Snatch Steal, unbelievable card. It's very difficult not to go +1 with Snatch Steal. Then for the trap lineups. This trap lineup I've always thought was really cool. We have 3 copies of Sakuratsu Armor, like I mentioned when talking about the monsters and even the spells. So we have 3 Sakuratsu Armor. And then 3 copies of Widespread Ruin. I've elected to show one of these decks that just maxes out on Smash and Ground, Widespread Ruin, and Reaper, because I think it's just such a cliche way of imagining this format and a good base for talking about the Dark Hole Reaper format for the first time. I know a lot of you in the comments comment on some of the rarity choices in some of my profiles. I've actually been reluctant to profile this format because I've been trying to get more copies of the super rare Widespread Ruin from the video game. This card can be really difficult to find, and I've always only had 1 copy, and I've eventually just decided to concede that I'd rather profile the format than just try and find more copies. But there's 1 Italian super rare Widespread Ruin that's really kind of cool, because it came in the same set as this one, but in the European versions, it came super rare. There are also English versions of this super rare that are pretty cool, but we have Widespread Ruin. English ones as in English released in Europe. The United States ones, or the North American ones, had the prismatic secret rare. But other cool aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! History, talking about some of these rarities. We want to get through our Donzalugs and our Reapers, pretty common theme of the format. So we have a couple copies of Dust Tornado to pick off some of these 1-for-1 back rows. We have a Call Haunted, which is good with Call Dust Tornado, and then 1 copy of Torrential. So this card is such a backbreaking card in this format. Torrential and Dark Hole are really the only 2 mass removal cards you're going to find. And a lot of the game was kind of predicated on playing around, or at least trying to read if your opponent has Torrential, and then obviously the importance of Dark Hole. There is no extra deck for this particular version of the deck because I've elected not to play Cyberstein. You could play Cyberstein, but you would be playing more of a sort of committed Cyberstein deck. We're not really to the point where tech Cyberstein is a thing, so I've elected not to include an extra deck. Because of the existence of Cyberstein, though, you should have a... If I went back and played, I would show up with 3 of every extra deck monster possible. This was at a point in time where there was no limit to the extra deck, so you literally could just go 3x every fusion in the entire game. I probably would be the person who would do that. Just not necessarily just to be prepared for everything, because minus cards like Exchange, you're really not going into it. But you don't want your opponent to read that you don't have Cyberstein, right? Your opponent, if they perceive you to potentially have Cyberstein in your deck and be the Cyberstein dedicated OTK deck, they might play a little bit more aggressively to get you under the 5,000 threshold, but that might not necessarily be the case if you show up with no extra deck at all. In terms of this format's an interesting one. There's a few theme decks, but it's a lot of good stuff decks. So I already mentioned that Cyberstein existed. We are at the point where we have Cyber End Dragon and Cyber Twin Dragon, so it's one of the better versions of Stein, right? Some of the early versions of Stein didn't have those cards, so we have a pretty good version of Cyberstein. We had a deck called Merchant Pot Turbo, the Pot deck. I'm eventually going to profile the Pot of Avarice deck, not Pot of Greed. Pot of Greed is banned, but Pot of Avarice, released in Elemental Energy, was the last released relative to when I'm profiling this deck. And there was a deck in which you tried to just merchant as many times as possible, whether you hit Pot of Avarice or not. You can theoretically fuel a lot of monsters into the grave and then Pot of Avarice it back. And in a format where +1s are everything, Pot of Avarice is technically a +1 if you can get the monsters in the graveyard. So we have merchant decks. There were some early chaos decks. In retrospect, I think the whole format, if we go back and replay it, would just be all chaos decks. It would basically be what the next format was, Chaos Return. But there were a few chaos decks here or there that we had to, at least consider. There were some Bazoo decks, Paul Levitin and others made famous Return from the Different Dimension Bazoo-based strategies. This is that time period. I'll probably eventually profile that deck too, but we have Bazoo to represent that. I have a DD Warrior Lady that I've always used to represent good stuff decks. I have a Mystic Swordsman to represent the Warrior Toolbox decks. And I have a Brain Control to represent Monarch decks that existed. So Shadow of Infinity was released at the very end of this format, and I've elected not to include Treeborn Frog in this deck or just in any of the decks that I talk about, because Treeborn Frog-based Monarch decks are quite a bit different than the earlier Monarch decks that just use Soul Exchange and Brain Control. But Brain Control was legal. It was at 3. No limitation. Pre-errata. In retrospect, there were probably some pretty good Monarch decks that existed, kind of like how in GOAT format, people back in the day didn't play a bunch of Monarch decks, and even in modern day GOAT, people don't necessarily play a bunch of fully dedicated Monarch decks, but it is something that you could see here or there. So I'm using Brain Control to represent that instead of something like Zaborg, just to point out that there were some pretty powerful Monarch cards that existed. In terms of what our side deck looks like, going back and looking at side decks during this time period honestly gives me a headache, because a lot of times it's a bunch of one-ofs that sometimes have logic to them. Sometimes I don't think really have any logic to them. So I tried to be somewhat authentic to the time period, but then still concede that I need to present a side deck that I think is somewhat coherent. So I decided to go with a lot more 2-ofs than 1-ofs. I have 2 copies of Gold. Gold is a card for the mirror match, which might seem odd, right? What am I going to play Gold for? Well, if your opponent's playing 3 Reapers and Dawn, there is a universe where if you are able to hit a gold out of your opponent's hand, it can be backbreaking, because all of a sudden it hits the field, it kills the Reaper, it kills another card, and now there's a 2300 body on the field. There are also Monarch decks that play the Stalo, so being able to special summon this and then hit the Monarch plus another card on the field can be really good. So 2 copies of Gold to counteract cards getting ripped out of your hand. 2 copies of Kuribo to counteract the Cyberstein, and maybe even other OTKs. Benkai was technically legal in other cards as well, but primarily Cyberstein. 2 copies of Kinetic Soldier, going back to Widespread Ruin. These are also similar to that, where they're super rare, but from Europe. 1 French, I think 1 Italian. I have a French, Italian, German, and English version of this card in Super, so it's kind of similar to that Widespread Ruin. but 2 copies of Kinetic Soldier to counteract all of the warrior decks. It's okay in the sense that a lot of the warriors that exist are DD Warrior Lady and Assailant, and in both of those cases it's just a 1-for-1, but you can attack over Dawn, and you can attack over the other warriors that exist, like Mystic Swordsman, DD Survivor. You can also just set this, and with 1800 defense, none of the warriors are going to be able to deal with that. Technically, your opponent can attack over Cyber Dragons, you do have to worry about that, but against all the warriors, this card can be backbreaking. I have 2 copies of Drillroid. I elected to put Drillroid in the side deck just because it's a cool card. I don't know if I've profiled it yet, and it was somewhat popular during this format. I don't think it was a very good idea per se, but it was somewhat common to see cards like Drillroid, where you could actually counteract Kinetic Soldier for what that is worth in defense mode. You also could just attack Spy and at least somewhat deal with it. For those of you that know sort of the robust card pool at the time, you might look at this and say, well, why not just play, if you really worry about defense position monsters, Ninja Grandmaster Suzuki? Well, with Grandmaster Suzuki, the monster needs to already be in face-up defense position. This, it doesn't matter. This can attack a face down, and although the flip effect works, it does still destroy the monster in defense position. So this can attack a Spy. It flips, you get another Spy, but it kills that Spy. Whereas if a Ninja Grandmaster Suzuki attacks a Spy, it flips, gets a Spy, and then you have to worry about another battle phase. So theoretically, this card was probably better, although Ninja Grandmaster Suzuki is a warrior with more attack. We have 2 copies of Disc Wombat for the burn decks. I actually guess I don't have a burn deck card down here, and I probably should have had a burn deck card. There were some burn decks that existed, so imagine a card like Stealth Bird, Wave Motion Cannon, Gravity Bind, those style of decks, so having a card like this is pretty good. I have 1 copy of Morphing Jar, not that you could play more. I have a Morphing Jar here because with gold, there's a little bit of synergy there, and if you're playing it against a hand deck, a hand rip deck, I'm talking about the Reaper Gonzaloo deck like this one, essentially the mirror match, it's not a horrible idea where, let's say your opponent started to snowball you, you didn't have an out to Reaper, you draw Morphing Jar, and all of a sudden you do get back into the game because your opponent in this format's unwilling to set a bunch of back row because of Mobius and Heavy Storm. Maybe they're unwilling to invest another monster on the field because of Dark Hole, and all of a sudden you can just set this, flip it when your opponent attacks into it, and now your opponent might not expect that all of a sudden you're back somewhat at parity. Plus, they're combos if you happen to have gold in your hand. We have a copy of Confiscation, just to demonstrate this card was legal. It wasn't overwhelmingly popular, but it's an incredibly good card just in general. And against some of the, let's say, Cyberstein combo-ish decks, I think it's a very valid card to play. Cards like Drop Dash Shoot are probably better overall because you could chain it to Giant Trine, but we are before the time that people were popularizing cards like Drop Dash Shoot. So to be authentic to the time period and illustrate that there was actually a pretty powerful spell card that was legal, I have elected to put 1 copy of Confiscation. 2 copies of Royal Decree. I have Decree here primarily because of the burn strategies, but it's also pretty good against Return from the Different Dimension strategies. This is a weird time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where people would just side a low quantity of Royal Decrees, even 1, right? I go back and look at some side decks, there's 1 Royal Decree, where they actually still just have a lot of traps in their deck naturally, and sometimes they play with Decree and sometimes they don't, and the game is not intended to be one of those games where Decree sits there the whole time because Mobius, Breaker, MST Heavy exists, so you kind of just 1-for-1 trade with a back row, maybe force through a Donzalug attack, and then eventually if the Decree dies, no big deal. And then I put 1 copy of Ceasefire. Time wasn't that big of an issue, but it could theoretically have been an issue, and you did still see a couple Ceasefires here or there, and I was looking for a 15th card, and it's one of those old school cards that I always like to profile because I've always thought it was a pretty cool card. But without getting into the idea of 15 singletons and some of the other ones, I think this side deck is representative enough of what the format looked like, still authentic to the time period, but still conceding what I think a good side deck probably could have looked like by having a little bit more of 2-ofs as opposed to 1-ofs. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.